Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my current top 10 decks in the standard format. With the 2024-2025 season quickly approaching along with the 2024 World Championships happening in August, it's really important to make sure that you're keeping up with the metagame. So today we're going to be going over my current top 10 decks in the format, starting at 10 and then going all the way to 1. So if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. It's the best way to help me out as a creator. And all right, let's hop right into it. Alrighty, hopping into number 10 here, we have Miraidon EX. Miraidon EX has been around for quite some time, and it still is continuing to perform relatively well. We saw one get top 16, and then this is going to be the list that Ian Robb used to get top 32. So the deck still continues to see success. We saw from the brand new set Iron Thorns and Blood Moon Ursaluna be added into this deck, and those cards actually make a lot of sense. The Iron Thorns is really strong against decks like Charizard and also the Lugia V-Star matchup. We also got Blood Moon Ursaluna as well, which fixes one of the big problems Miraidon often seems to have, which is kind of like that end game. It feels like the deck kind of just runs out of steam sometimes. So having the Blood Moon Ursaluna is really nice, as you can finish off the games with that final hit from the Blood Moon. You got pretty much a lot of other standard cards you see in the majority of Miraidon lists. We got the double Iron Hands. You know, your goal at the very beginning of the games is to try and get that turn 1 or 2 amp you very much, which is why we see double turbo energy in this list. We got things like Raikou as well, paired up with Seal Stone. You got your V Pokemon to be able to search out whatever card you need with that Seal Stone. Town Store also allows you to get that. We got Mew EX as well, pretty decent attacker in some situations, but mainly there for the draw support, which is really good towards the end of the game. Also is a nice pivot card as well due to its free retreat. Squawkabilly, great to use towards the end of the game. We got the Iron Bundle as well. Good to get out of, potentially things like Fluttermane in some spots, but for the most part, can't force up Pokemon that they typically don't want to be put into the active spot, potentially allowing you to use things like Iron Hands as amp you very much, or just taking a big 2-prize knockout with something like Raichu V. Zapdos as well helps to hit those numbers as well, being able to deal 10 extra damage. Can sometimes be the difference from winning or losing a matchup. Rest of the list here is relatively standard. Miraidon's still solid. I think that it does struggle to decks like Charizard, however, and I think Charizard is going to be seeing a lot more play moving forward, so that is, kind of a big problem that the deck has, but I definitely think it's a respectable deck. It is okay versus decks like Gardevoir and Lost Box. Both of those matchups aren't necessarily exceptional, but if you are able to get the turn 1 Iron Hands off, it kind of feels like you can beat almost anything. Alrighty, hopping into number 9 here, we got Snorlax Stall. Snorlax Stall is still a very viable deck. It takes a pretty strong matchup against decks like Lost Zone Toolbox, and Lost Zone just won the North American International Championships. Takes decent matchups against things like Raging Bolt. Charizard as well, you do well against Chen Pao. Has been seeing some more play as well, and Snorlax does really well against that matchup. So you get a decent amount of good matchups. However, you definitely have some matchups that can be quite tough. For example, the Lugia matchup is definitely one of your deck's harder matchups, along with also Gardevoir as well. Gardevoir has been going up to 2 of the Professor Turo scenario, which definitely makes things quite hard for Snorlax to win. However, some of the Gardevoir lists have been cutting Psychic Energies, which does make the matchup a little bit better for Snorlax, but I definitely still think it is relatively hard to beat from the Snorlax end. Overall, the deck is still relatively good. It's just you're kind of playing matchup roulette with it, and you kind of have to accept that. There's just going to be some situations where you play against a list that, has all the switch cards they need, and like they're teched for like this matchup, and there's not anything that you can do, or you could hit decks that your opponent just has absolutely no out. So it definitely is, kind of a risk to play, but I do think it actually is relatively solid right now. You just have to accept the fact that it is kind of matchup roulette. Alrighty, hopping into number 8, we have Chen Pao. Chen Pao is a deck that I actually think is relatively underrated right now. We saw Nicholas Moffat get really close to top 8 at the North American International Championships with this Chen Pao deck. However, they did lose their winning and finishing, I believe, 10-1-4. So the deck is still seeing success. I think it actually gets a little bit better as decks like Charizard are beginning to get more hype recently, because decks like Dragapult have not been seeing as much success. So I think Chen Pao's matchup spread is actually relatively okay right now. You can add in things like the Manaphy, which is really good against things like Mirror Match, but but also very solid against the Lost Zone Toolbox matchup, because if you don't play something like Manaphy, it kind of just comes down to whoever can Radiant Greninja first, which typically just means it's a coin flip matchup. So adding in that Manaphy definitely helps out in that situation. However, the number one thing with this deck that holds it back is itself. Its consistency just sometimes is not really always there. So you kind of always have to take the risk of you know, choosing to play something like Chen Pao being incredibly powerful and you feeling absolutely like great for playing it, and then you'll sometimes just not set up, right? And that's kind of the problem that this deck has, is that it is kind of a glass cannon. However, when you get going, it's pretty powerful, and I definitely think it still is a decent pick for upcoming tournaments. I think it's still going to do pretty well in the standard format. Alrighty, hopping into number 7 here, we have Regidrago V-Star. Regidrago V-Star has been a card that has been around for quite some time. However, it hasn't really ever seen that much success. The only success it saw was a little bit with Arceus V-Star, but aside from that, it just has not really seen much play. However, with the addition of Teal Mask, it actually is a pretty strong deck right now. We saw Jacob I get top 16 at the North American International Championships with this deck, and there were also plenty of them in day 2. So the deck saw some success and definitely surprised a lot of people, and I actually think it's really, really powerful. Legacy Star is a really cool V-Star effect, allowing you to discard the top 7 cards of your deck, and you get to put 2 cards from your discard pile back into your hand, which is pretty cool. You got a lot of versatility as well. I mean, you got things like a Dragapult EX that you can copy with the Regidrago's attack. You got Hisuian Gudra. You got Raging Bolt for those big one-hit knockouts to finish the game, and you also have things like Noivern as well. So a lot of versatility, very solid deck. Can definitely still struggle sometimes with consistency or running out of resources. Sometimes you'll just use the Legacy Star and you'll discard way too many, you know, really good cards that, you know, getting back to isn't really enough. So that's, you know, kind of a problem that you sometimes run into, but you do take actually decent matchups against plenty of the top decks in the format right now. Matchups like Gardevoir you feel pretty good against, as you can either use Gudra on the second turn or something like Dragapult, and it's actually pretty difficult for them to deal with it. You're also pretty good against things like Lost Zone Toolbox, as if you're able to hit turn 2 Dragapult, you should just win that matchup most of the time. So your matchups are actually relatively good. It just sometimes the deck kind of screws itself over when it uses something like Legacy Star and gets rid of too many good cards. But overall, it's a solid deck. I definitely think it's going to continue to see success, and it's actually one of the coolest decks in the format as well. If you want a fun deck that is actually really solid right now, Regidrago is a good choice. Alrighty, hopping into number 6 here, we got Raging Bolt. Raging Bolt is still one of the most played decks currently in the standard format, and I actually think it's a lot better than what people are giving it credit for. I know there's a lot of slander about the deck, people saying the deck was really bad or just like super, just like way too linear, but I actually think that its linearity is its strength. I think that what it loses in matchup spread, it gains in consistency. You know, being able to pretty much say, I'm going to be able to set up at a higher rate than the majority of the top decks in the standard format is definitely very, very nice, because it takes a lot of 50-50 matchups. However, this deck is very good at capitalizing on your opponent when they're not able to get that perfect setup, being able to use things like Pokemon Catcher or Prime Catcher turn 1 paired up with Sada's Vitality is just very, very powerful. You know, just kind of the aggression that this deck has is definitely what makes it still very solid. I think Trekking Shoes is also the way to go. I think you just want to go fast. You want to be able to burn through your deck as quickly as possible. You really want to do what makes Raging Bolt such a powerful card, is being able to hit on that first turn for tons and tons of damage, which with things like the Trekking Shoes, Pokemon Catcher, you know, kind of giving you that board control is, I think, in my opinion, the best way to play the deck. We also got Lost Vacuum as well. This is a card that has been in and out of a lot of the Raging Bolt decks. I think Lost Vacuum makes a lot of sense because it actually helps out in things like the mirror match, for example, you know, being able to remove their Bravery Charm if they do decide to play it. Some lists do still play Bravery Charm. I don't think it's necessary in my opinion, but it most importantly helps out in the Gardevoir matchup. The Gardevoir matchup is really, really tough if you don't play something like Lost Vacuum. However, with something like Lost Vacuum, you can actually take big 3 prize turns using the Lost Vacuum to remove something like a Bravery Charm off a Screamtail or something like a Drift Balloon, taking a prize card and then using Pokemon Catcher, Prime Catcher, or the boss's orders to take a big knockout on the Gardevoir EX, taking half your prize cards. That makes the matchup significantly closer. I actually think turns it from about a 35-65 into about a 50-50 or 45-55. It definitely makes the matchup closer if you do play Vacuum and they aren't necessarily able to consistently pull off the play where they target down the Teal Mask or the Squawkabilly and then hit you for 180 and potentially use something like the Monkey Dory. If they do pull that off, it can definitely be hard. However, if you are able to, take out their Curlias in the early game with things like Pokemon Catcher or Prime Catcher or Boss, kind of stifle their board state a little bit, then those plays are going to be relatively hard for them to pull off, and the matchup actually gets very, very close. So look to target down Curlias in that matchup as quickly as possible, and if you're able to do that, you actually got a shot against a matchup that I think a lot of people think is really, really bad. But overall, Bolt is still very good. I think it's a lot better than what people give it credit for. I think it's going to see a decent amount of success at Worlds. It functions. It's good. I like the deck. All right, let's move on to number 5. Alrighty, hopping into number 5 here, we have Dragapult. Dragapult is a deck that didn't necessarily do very well at the North American International Championships, as it doesn't have great matchups against things like Raging Bolt. A lot of those kind of hyper-aggressive decks that a lot of people played to the tournament really pushed this deck down. I think the highest placing Dragapult list was in the top 32, which for the amount of hype the card got is pretty disappointing. But I actually think it is a little bit better as of right now, as Dragapult does do pretty decently against Gardevoir and Lost Zone Toolbox, which were arguably the most successful decks at the event. It does decently against Charizard as well, and Charizard is starting to gain more popularity, so it definitely has some decent matchups. However, its consistency is kind of awkward sometimes. Sometimes it's just not able to get set up at the rate as something, like Charizard is able to do. Even though the list is relatively similar to what a Charizard list would look like, it still just doesn't flow necessarily the same way. However, when it does get fully powered up, it's really, really scary, and how the meta is kind of starting to develop, I think it's a lot better than it was a couple of weeks ago. Deck strong, I respect it, and I think it's going to see more success moving forward. Alrighty, hopping into number 4 here, we got Charizard. At the very beginning of the format, it seemed like a lot of people were writing this deck off. However, I think after Dragapult drastically underperformed at the North American International Championships, I think it actually has positioned itself relatively well currently in this format. You take solid matchups against Lost Zone Toolbox due to the fact that you have a Jirachi and also things like Professor Turo and Collapse Stadium. You do pretty well against that matchup. You do pretty well against decks like Gardevoir as well, because you have Lost Vacuum. And overall, like, when you kind of look at the matchup spread, it's pretty impressive. You do well against arguably the top 2 decks in the format. You do decently against decks like Raging Bolt because you have Radiant Charizard plus Unfair Stamp. That can be very, very difficult for them to deal with. You do decently against things like Chen Pao as well, because you have Counter Catcher or Boss's Orders plus Unfair Stamp, which is admittedly really difficult for them to deal with because you can knock out the Babero really quickly and put them to a low hand size. You got pretty much ways to beat the majority of the decks in the format. Yes, your Dragapult matchup is not great, probably your hardest matchup overall, aside from Stall and Control, but that's okay, because if Dragapult's losing steam and is not going to be a top 3 most played deck, then I think Charizard puts itself in a position where it's once again like a tier 1 deck. It's good. I think it's very, very solid, and I definitely think it's going to see success at Cups and Challenges to start the season, and I think also makes a really solid play for the World Championships. Deck's good. Alrighty, hopping into the top 3 here, we got Lugia V-Star. Lugia V-Star is still one of the strongest decks in the format. It didn't necessarily perform super well at NAIC, but I still think the deck is really, really good as of right now. We saw a couple of different builds. We saw the build that Alex Szymanski played that got top 32 that didn't play Shinshino, which I actually think is pretty interesting. However, with decks like Charizard and Dragapult potentially being decent plays moving forward, I think having the Shinshino is very, very nice for those matchups. Lugia is kind of a deck that when it gets set up, it can beat pretty much anything. However, kind of similar to Chen Pao, the deck just doesn't function always, which is kind of the problem. But I feel like I win more games with Lugia when I set up well, as opposed to something like Chen Pao, where I still feel like there's a lot of vulnerabilities that deck has. When Lugia sets up perfectly, it feels pretty much unbeatable. I mean, you got things like the gift energies to make yourself Unfair Stamp and any type of hand disruption proof. You got so many different attackers. I mean, you can attack with Lugia, Shinshino, Luminion, the Ursa Luna, the Iron Hands, list goes on and on. You just got so many different options. You can also get back the Legacy Energy to amp, multiple times as well. So there's just so many powerful things about this deck as of right now. It's just the biggest question is it going to get set up? And I think if it gets set up, it probably is the strongest deck overall, but that's just one of the things that is holding the deck back. Lugia is still good. I think it's going to see a lot of play. It's definitely a deck that can be kind of viewed as a glass cannon, but it's just so powerful when it gets functioning. If you're able to get a list that works, I definitely think it has tournament winning potential. Already hopping into number 2 here, we got Lost Zone Toolbox. Andrew Hedrick was able to win the most recent North American International Championships with a very similar list to this, and I still think the deck is absolutely incredible. You have a shot against pretty much everything. Almost all your matchups are at least 50-50 or slightly favored. Your only, I would say, difficult matchups being decks that tech in things like Jirachi, or potentially decks that can use Dragapult like Regidrago or, Pidgepolt. However, versus the rest of the format, I really think that you have a shot versus those. Things like Iron Hands is just so incredibly powerful. Iron Thorns is a really good card against things like Lugia, very solid against that matchup. Also good against decks like Raging Bolt, as you can just slow them down. Blood Moon Ursaluna was a huge addition to this deck from the brand new set. Such a strong card in general. We also got Manaphy as well. Manaphy very good for the mirror match, because if you play against these Lost Zone mirror matches and they don't play the Manaphy and you play Manaphy and also Roxanne, I think you're definitely heavily favored. Also helps out against the Chen Pao matchup. But yeah, Lost Zone, definitely one of the highest skill-based decks in the format. So if you're going to play it, you definitely need to put lots of practice into it. However, if you do get pretty much all the sequencing down and you understand exactly how you should be playing it, I think it's really, really powerful, and I think it's going to continue to see success. It makes a really good play as well in like best of 1 league challenges and league cups as well, just because this deck is very consistent. It's able to function at a higher rate than a lot of other decks. So playing, a turbo fast deck at, these cups and challenges is definitely something that I could see, being a smart decision. I think that, Lost Box definitely makes a lot of sense. All right. Deck's really good. Very powerful, could beat pretty much anything. However, in my opinion, there's just one deck in the format that is slightly better than it. Alrighty, hopping into number 1 here, we got Gardevoir EX. Gardevoir EX took 6 of the top 8 spots at the North American International Championships, which is just absolutely crazy. The fact that 6 out of the top 8 decks at the biggest tournament in North America of the year had the exact same deck is just kind of wild to think of. But there's a reason as to why. The deck truly has outs against pretty much every deck currently in this format. You got things like the Cresselia to help out in the mirror match, good versus Lost Zone, good versus Dragapult. You got things like the Fluttermane and also the Klefki, really helps out against the Lost Zone matchup. Things like Manaphy as well to block things like the Radiant Greninja. You have the ability to one-shot pretty much everything with things like the Driftbloom paired up with the Monkey Dory Bravery Charm. You just have everything. You have the ability to make, comebacks with cards like Iono or like Unfair Stamp. You can get, like into 2-shot wars with things like the EX because you play 2 of the Professor Turo scenario. You really just have everything in this deck. It's a deck that you can pretty much go into any matchup and say, all right, I at least have a line. I can pretty much beat anything in the format as of right now, like with this deck. I think it's amazing. It can beat most things. And yeah, in my opinion, it's the best deck in the standard format. But with that being said, let me know if you agree with the list in the comments. Let me know if you think I missed anything. And if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. It's the best way to help me out as a creator. And if you're looking for any Pokemon TCG product, make sure to go check out GameGridSLC.com. The link will be in the description. You can use my code SmartTCG for 5% off on your next order. That's it for me today. Thanks for all the support recently. The love has been awesome. So I hope to be continuing to create hopeful, informative, consistent content for you all. But all right, that's all for me. You have a great one, and I'll speak with you again soon. Peace out.